From my many interactions with home growers over the years, I've found that it's pretty common for people to get really excited about starting their garden in springtime, but have a lot of that excitement just fizzle out halfway through the garden season. Maybe a couple of things go wrong, maybe they get behind on a couple of tasks or forget a couple of things, and pretty soon things are out of control and it starts to seem easier to just throw in the towel and start again with a clean slate the next year. But that's not okay. I want you to enjoy your entire gardening season, get the most of all of your harvests, and see it through right until the end. And that's why I made this video for you. Today we're going to talk about how to restore order in your garden. It's going to take a little bit of discipline, but if you can avoid making these 9 common mistakes, things are going to get a whole lot easier for you, and one day you're going to look back and wonder how gardening ever felt so complicated and overwhelming to you. So let's get started. The first problem I want to address is edge creep. I think this is one of the best places to start for any gardener because all gardens have edges, and if you can control the edges, you can not only eliminate the amount of weed pressure and grass pressure creeping into your garden, but it also gives you a sense of control in your gardening world because you know that everything within those edges is the place where you focus. Everything outside the edges you can disregard and leave for another time. So it's a really positive place to start. We're going to use our boulevard as an example for this one because this area that you see I'm standing on right now used to be covered with grass and weeds that were always creeping into our boulevard space. Then one year I started to think, well, wouldn't it be easier if I just cover this space? I'll take one step, one action, I'll cover it with landscape fabric and let that smother out all the grass and weeds. And since I did that, my labor has dramatically been reduced on this area. Occasionally a weed will pop up. Here are a couple, I can pop those out quickly. But now these days, whenever I come out to work in the boulevard, I'm just focusing on the crops that I've got. I'm not spending any time mowing grass along the boulevard or seeing weeds go to seed and seeing those seeds blow into my garden space. So this one action of controlling the edge of our garden has continued to benefit me years down the road. I've got a couple more examples of edge creep in this garden plot. This area may seem innocent enough, but this end zone here was really annoying me. It was filled with invasive grass like this. Quack grass is what we call it in our neck of the woods here. This whole area was grassy and it was constantly creeping into my garden beds. Technically it's off the property, so I thought, well, it's not my responsibility. I'll let it go for a few years and see what happens. But it was continually creeping into my beds, creating more work for me and making my garden less orderly. And all it took for me to remedy this situation earlier this year was to come out here in spring with a garden fork, spend 15 minutes just cleaning it out, roots and all, making sure I got all the rhizomes, laying down this landscape fabric, and just walking away. And now I don't have grass constantly creeping in. I've got a controlled setting here. There's order to the end of this bed. We had another edge at this site that was always a little bit out of control, and that was the border of these beds here where the soil meets the sidewalk. Our soil has risen a little bit over time as we've added compost, and that's created a bit of an angle here, and the soil's been drifting down, and this southern faced slope was a perfect place for weeds to continually germinate. I was always having to weed here and also make an effort to shovel the soil back uphill to my garden beds. So this spring I finally took the time to build this little retaining wall. A simple project was all it took to define this edge. Now we've got concrete on one side, garden soil on the other side, much less work for me and more order to the whole situation. Oop, there's a potato beetle. Squish. The second common mistake is using irregularly sized beds. All of our garden plots are going to start with a blank slate. And when you're starting with a blank slate, it's easy to get pulled in different directions by your crop planning needs. Like maybe you want to use a certain amount of space for potatoes, so potatoes get a bed that's this size. And then you want this much space for winter squash, and winter squash gets a bed that's a different size, and lettuce gets a bed that's a different size, and celery gets a bed that's a different size. And pretty soon you're left with this mosaic of irregularly shaped beds, different sizes, a weird layout to deal with. And that's a challenge. That irregularity is a challenge. So my encouragement for you to bring order to this all is to standardize your bed layout. On our various properties, we only have 2 different bed sizes. Right here, we're standing in the middle of our kitchen garden zone where we've got 15 square foot beds. These are smaller beds that we use for crops that need to be tended frequently, where we want smaller quantities. And the benefit of using the same size bed for even just a smaller zone like this is that all of these smaller trellises are completely interchangeable. These smaller hoops and netting that go over the hoops, that's all interchangeable for any bed here. It always works. So anytime I need to put hoops and netting over a bed, I can just pull out the same gear, cover the bed. It's easy. I'm not always searching for different size components or remanufacturing different size components to make it work on different size beds. Outside of this kitchen garden zone, every bed is also standardized, but to a larger size of 50 square feet. So even larger structures like this that you see behind me, this high tunnel, is still subdivided into smaller zones of 50 square feet. Now you're going to have crops that demand more than one standard size bed, and that's totally fine. Just use multiple beds. The boulevard that we just visited for the first section is filled with 12 beds of wheat and 8 beds of oats. It's easy for me to use multiple beds for the same crop, but it's really hard for me to reshape my beds every season. So use standard size beds and make your life easy. Mistake number 3 is planting too many crops. So let's move into a larger space where this tends to be more of a problem. This high tunnel space is a fun place to play with, and I got to admit, when it's seed selection time, I am tempted to pick 50 different varieties of tomatoes and melons and peppers so I can experience all their different flavors and appearances. But I also know that every single variety I select comes with its own unique timing, maintenance demands, and harvest window, so every crop I add makes it less possible for me to streamline my tasks. This 20-foot strip of tomatoes here against the wall is all the same variety. That means I can plant them all at the same time. I can treat them all the same way in terms of trellising. I'll be able to harvest them at the same time. That's reducing the number of actions that I need to make. These middle beds here are all melons, but admittedly there are 2 varieties of melons on each side. So that's complicated my work a little bit, and I can already see some difference in growth rates on each side. But at least we've got watermelons on one side and cantaloupes and honeydew on that side, so that's simplifying things a little bit. But an extreme example of this is a grower that I spoke to last week who told me proudly that she was growing 60 varieties of beans. Only a couple plants of each, but 60 different varieties. That's 60 different days to maturity, 60 different harvest periods, 60 different growth habits to manage. Imagine how much simpler that could be if she just had 60 plants of one variety. You're decreasing your responsibility for management almost infinitely if you can reduce the amount of varieties that you're growing. So that's why in the 6,000 square feet of growing space that we're managing this year, we've only selected 53 crop varieties in total. That is plenty to manage already. I don't need to further complicate that by adding 10 extra varieties of tomatoes. Some growers have approached me with a concern that they want to avoid starting a monocrop in their garden because monocrops generally have a bad reputation in agriculture. But you should not have that fear. As a home grower doing things by hand, you are not going to do anything big enough to be called a monocrop. So if you want to grow a big patch of onions, grow a big patch of onions, carrots, potatoes, whatever. Plant as much as you want. The diversity in the surrounding landscape around your garden is going to be enough to prevent anything that you're doing from being identified as a monocrop. So keep your crop selection to a minimum, and you'll thank yourself many times over throughout the season because you'll appreciate how much simpler things are down the road. Mistake number 4 is experiment overload. You're keen to learn, that's great, but you can only learn when you're paying attention. And there are only so many things that you can pay attention to. So keep your experiments to a minimum so that you can glean the most value from those experiments. In the 60 standard beds that I'm managing this year, I only have 3 new experiments. This is one of them right here. We've got June-bearing strawberries versus day-neutral strawberries. I'm keen to see how the yields and timing of those yields compare, but in order for me to get those answers, I need to be paying attention here. I need to be harvesting on time and measuring my harvest from each bed so that I can compare the numbers. The second experiment is right here. I thought, wouldn't it be great if we could grow early snap peas on a 5-foot high trellis and then use that same trellis for a secondary planting of pole beans without having to move the trellis to a different bed for the different crops. This would also solve the problem of having empty space in this bed after an early crop of peas that I would have to plant with something else anyways. So this experiment required me to be alert and paying attention to the pace of growth of my peas, noticing when the first harvests were coming, then seeding the beans at the right time. They're already starting to grow and ready to take over climbing the trellis. And that's where we're at today. Our peas have maybe one more small picking to go, and our beans are already a couple feet into the air here, ready to cling to a string. So later today, and I'll show you some B-roll as I talk here, I'm going to strip the peas down from this trellis and tie individual strings from the top of the pole here to the base of each group of beans so that they've got a path to follow to the top of this trellis. I'd be happy to tell you at this point that I could use the same trellis for both crops, but speaking from experience, when you're trying to remove bean vines from a trellis grid like this 6-inch polypropylene netting, it's an amazing hassle. The beans slide off much more easily when you're removing them from a vertical piece of twine, so it's worth my time now to just add single lengths of twine for each of these beans to climb up to the top. Experiment number 3 is right around the corner in the high tunnel here. This one is the simplest of all. We're just growing a brand new crop that we've never done before. The crop is tomatillos, or ground cherries. We've got 1 standard bed length to devote to this crop. I've researched the ideal spacing, the most promising method of support, and we're just going to roll with it. All the same treatment for the entire bed. That gives me one clean style of production to collect information from this year, but I'm not going to be able to collect that information unless I'm paying attention. So by limiting my number of experiments in my whole garden, I'm able to give this crop the attention it needs so that I can learn the most from it this year. So when you're in the planting stage next season, remember to keep your experiments to the minimum. 10-20% of your beds at most should be devoted to new things that you're curious about. Try to keep the rest consistent, same crops, even same varieties of crops, so that you know exactly what you're getting into. Mistake number 5 is refusing to invest in technology. And for this one I got to start with the story, because this story actually inspired this entire video. I was biking home from the swimming pool last week, feeling really good about my summer actually. The gardens were under control. We had already been away for a couple of vacations. I had a couple of family gatherings to look forward to, and things were looking good. Life was in balance. I just had some exercise. At one point on my way home, I look over and I see Walter working in his garden. And I say working because what Walter was doing was just holding a spray nozzle, watering his garden very, very slowly. In fact, it was taking so long to water his garden that Walter had pulled out a chair to his garden and was simply sitting there doing this. Now, it might seem like an action like this isn't necessarily destroying order or bringing chaos to a garden, but if we think about the entire story here, Walter's probably imagining that gardening is taking him a lot of time. And because time is ultimately going to be your limiting factor, if you're spending time doing things like watering, you're going to start cutting corners on other elements like pruning or trellising or weeding in some areas, and things are eventually going to break down because you spent too much time doing something simple like this that could easily be replaced by a timer. The only time I ever pull out a nozzle like this is when I have just transplanted a crop. I give a bed a good soak. From that point on, my water timer and my drip irrigation system looks after all the watering, so my hands are free for all the other tasks that can't be automated. So irrigation, like I said, is one of the first things to automate. Another piece of technology that's really good when you're getting started, especially if you're expanding your garden to larger spaces, is a mechanical seeder. This huge strip of carrots here that's right beside me was seeded with mechanical seeder in less than a minute. Our large patches of wheat and oats are done with mechanical seeder as well, even high density plantings of spinach. If you're planting large volumes of crops, especially high density crops, mechanical seeder can go a long way to cutting time on that seeding labor. It might not be obvious at first which tasks you can accelerate with the use of technology, but a hint would be if you have to sit down to do it because it's taking so long, maybe that's something simple enough that a computer could do the same job for you. So make a couple of key investments in technology to save yourself some time. Automated irrigation and mechanical seeder are my top 2 recommendations to start with. Mistake number 6 is allowing empty space to exist in your garden. This is one of the cardinal sins of easy vegetable growing, because anytime we allow empty space in our garden, it's an open invitation for any weeds in the area to come in and set up shop. And of course, you know, more weeds in our garden means more work, more chaos, and less order. So anytime we harvest a crop before the season is over, we want to do our best to replace that empty space with a secondary crop. Not only will this give us more food, it'll also reclaim the empty space before any weeds can move in and take over. An example of where we've reclaimed empty space in this property is right here. Last week, this was carrots, a full bed of carrots. I harvested them all, and there was an empty bed available to plant. I'd been thinking ahead though, and already had the corn started, so within 24 hours I was transplanting corn in the same spot. Another example of when we've reclaimed space quickly is right behind us here. This bed was lettuce just a few days ago, but our spring lettuce had run its course and was ready to come out, so immediately after that I had some cauliflower ready to go. And now that cauliflower have full domain over this space, they'll expand quickly and cover this bed surface as well. Another quick relay moving in the opposite direction, just a few beds over, is an early bed of cauliflower. You can see these heads are mature and about to come out in the next 3 to 5 days here. And as soon as they come out, we'll be able to replant this bed with lettuce, radishes, herbs, quick growing crops that'll take us into fall. So quick relay plantings like that are nice, moving from one crop to another to avoid empty space, but at all costs, if you don't have anything else planned, just cover the bed with a tarp or landscape fabric or a thick layer of mulch. Just make sure you don't have bare soil openly inviting a bunch of weeds to come in and take over your garden and add work to your schedule. Error number 7 is clinging to mistakes. Mistakes are going to happen in your garden. I still make mistakes these days. You're probably not perfect either, so something wrong is going to happen throughout your growing season. What I see from new growers commonly is that they love their plants so much that they want to see them through right to the bitter end, even when things have gone wrong. And often those cases can lead to much lost productivity, more maintenance than would have been needed otherwise, and a general sense of disorder and dissatisfaction with the gardening experience. So oftentimes it can be better to just cut your losses, regroup, and start again. So here are a couple of examples of when I've done that in this plot. My first seeding of carrots in this bed this year, I cut a couple of corners during the germination process and I didn't get good germination as a result. So I had to make a decision. Do I want to keep growing out these carrots and see just 30% of the carrots grow to maturity and get a really poor yield and feel bad about myself every time I see this bed throughout the entire season? I'd rather not. So I scratched out the old carrots, reseeded again, this time giving the carrots the moisture they needed during the germination phase. And now we're looking at a really clean bed of carrots, and I feel good about myself. That positivity radiates throughout the rest of my gardening and helps me maintain order in everything else that is happening in this growing space. This is the scene of another gardening disaster from earlier in the spring. I was out here with my mechanical seeder seeding some other crops and thought, I know I want some beets here this year, so I'm gonna just quickly put in some beets with my mechanical seeder. It's not gonna give me the perfect spacing, and I know there's some weed pressure in this area of my garden, but we'll see how it turns out. Maybe I'll get a quick win and save a bit of time and avoid doing the transplants. So I did that. A couple weeks later, there was just a burst of weeds germinating alongside my beets in this bed. And a less experienced grower at this point might have felt the need to try to recover desperately by spending a lot of time out here weeding, or what would probably happen is that weeding job would get put off and neglected and this whole bed would just be a weed disaster. So instead of letting that prediction come to light, I just covered the entire bed right then and there with a sheet of landscape fabric and waited. There was still enough time in the season to reseed beets at home and bring transplants out here, so that's what I did. And now I covered those beets on transplanting day and haven't come back here at all to weed since then. And now you can see how effective that covering of landscape fabric has been in killing all of the weeds that germinated with my beets and giving me a clean slate to start again with a bunch of new transplants. These guys are all looking great. Here's a couple little grass weeds in here to pull out. By changing course of actions there, not only did I save myself a lot of time, I also felt a lot better about the work I was doing. Putting transplants in is positive work. Tarping a bed is easy. Spending a lot of time out here pulling out millions of tiny little weeds is really negative work that feels disorderly and takes an unknown amount of time. It's frustrating. As much as you can, try to lean towards tasks that you know have a predictable amount of time, a predictable outcome, and lead to positive results like this. And the next time a mistake happens in your garden, there's probably a couple in there right now, be a little quicker to just cover it, clean out the bed, start again. Free yourself from the need to cling to that mistake until the bitter end. Mistake number 8 is doing things at the wrong time. So many of the actions I take in gardening can be made easier, quicker, and more effective even by simply doing them at the right time. And weed control is a perfect example. It's so easy to remove or kill a weed when it's in its infant stage, when it's just emerged from the soil. I can simply skim the surface of any exposed soil, and any weed I encounter will be killed easily with minimal effort. It's also pretty easy for me to pluck weeds out of my garden beds at this stage without having to worry about getting the entire root. If I just take the top off, it's dead. But if I want to remove weeds at the wrong time, the task becomes much more difficult. And I've got a perfect example of this, unfortunately, right beside us here. If we take a look behind our netted tunnel in this plot, you can see an area of extreme weed growth that's developed over the last month or so or more because I've just neglected this area. Now, if I'd been here and skimming the surface a few times, it would have taken me a minute to control this area. Now it's going to take me much longer and much more physical labor to get in here with a shovel or garden fork and extract each one of these weeds by hand, making sure to get the roots and all. I can no longer just clip them at the surface because they would just grow back. And what's worse is that because I've ignored this problem until now, these weeds are starting to creep into my netted tunnel as well. So the problem is growing because I've neglected it. Thankfully, this story of neglect is not the norm on my properties because I'm in the habit of skimming the surface of every inch of exposed soil on a regular basis. I'm in here once a week or at least once every 2 weeks to make sure any newly germinated weeds are quickly snuffed out while they're in their infant stage. Then I don't have to spend time on my hands and knees pulling things out the slow way. Timing is also really important when we're talking about the management of our trellised crops or anything that we want to prune. The more regularly I get to a crop like this behind me, which is cucumbers, the more easy it is for me to just simply wrap these vines around their twine, look for any little branches that I might need to snip off. Here's an example down here. Ideally, I want to do some pruning of these cucumbers when I'm just removing leaders that are this small. Boop, gone. Here's an example of one that I missed earlier. It's not a big consequence right now, but it's taking me a little longer. I got to pull out my scissors for this one. If I would be away for more of an extended period and miss much longer vines, then pretty soon I could easily have a jungle of interconnected cucumbers here. It would be really difficult to get in there and remove the unnecessary vines, and it's going to be much harder to access and see the fruit throughout the entire season. But if I'm here every second day, picking cucumbers that are the right size, snipping off those really small size leaders, then the work is really quick, and this orderly planting of cucumbers never devolves into a cucumber jungle. Let's move over to the high tunnel. Another task that requires just a little bit of attention is the Florida weave trellising technique that I'm using for these determinate tomatoes. It's a quick task, but I can't do it all at one point in the season. I just have to come back here at regular intervals and string a length of twine. So first, a couple of weeks ago, I was down here. I strung a few layers of twine, then I was back again doing this layer, and now the tomatoes are this tall and they need a little bit more support at the top. And I need to do this incrementally because the tomatoes won't grow into this form of trellising. It's kind of a sandwiching technique that I need to do only after the tomatoes have passed their previous height of support. So I'm all set up here. Since it's a good time to do it today, I'll do it as a demonstration. We're tied up to the first post there. I'm going to go outside one tomato, inside the next tomato, wrap this twine around the center post, outside one tomato, inside the next tomato, wrap it around the next post, outside one tomato, inside the next tomato, wrap it around the next post, outside one tomato, inside the next tomato. You can see why it's called a weave. This length of PVC pipe makes it infinitely easier to wind this twine through all these branches because you're not constantly getting the twine caught in all the branches. It puts your point of entry down below amidst the vines here. That makes it really easy to get that twine into the right space. So we've zigzagged our way through the tomatoes in one direction. Now we're going to reverse that zigzag so that every tomato that has a twine on the far side will now get a length of twine on the inside, and every tomato that has twine on the inside will now get a piece of twine on the other side. So we'll give every plant a firm barrier on each side that's anchored to the posts around it. Once we get to the edge here, we'll just clip off this last bit of twine and tie it tight. So I'll probably have to be here one more time before the end of the season to run another length of twine near the top of my stakes. I can't do it now because the vines aren't tall enough, so it's important for me to come back at the right time to do that final stage. So these are just a couple of examples of how timing matters in our garden right now. As you're performing maintenance on your garden site, think about what things would have been easier if you got to them sooner or later, and try to adjust your timing so that you can make your life easier. Mistake number 9 is ignoring supporting infrastructure. I know it's most exciting often to think about your actual growing space early on, but you also got to consider all the other tasks that go along with your gardening. There's the seed starting, the transfer of those transplants to your garden, all the harvesting, washing, and storage that's inevitably going to happen after you have mature crops. So early on, while you're getting your garden set up, consider spending half of your time investing in supporting infrastructure. We're here at our washing station now as an example of a great piece of infrastructure that's really helpful to make your gardening life feel a lot more orderly, especially once you get into heavy harvest mode later on in the season. We've got some salad spinner and air bubblers down there and some fans for drying down on this side, but the core of a station that you could start with is just a simple roof, maybe even skip the roof, but a washing table that's got some metal hardware cloth on it, a tray to catch the water, and a bin below that can be used to pump out any excess water that drains, so you're not just standing in a pool of muddy water at the end of it all. So if you're currently trying to negotiate a process for washing potatoes or carrots on your lawn or your picnic table, this is going to be a dream come true. And as soon as you've got a place and routines for stuff like this, everything becomes quicker, more pleasant, and your attitude improves, and you're suddenly not putting off tasks because they're undesirable. You're just getting right to them. They take less time, and you've got more time for other things. Let's head closer to our house to look at another piece of supporting infrastructure that's been really helpful. This nursery greenhouse was the other supporting infrastructure that I wanted to highlight as something that really helps establish order, especially during our seed starting phase of the year. Since we start most of our plants indoors, at some point I have to harden them off to the outdoor elements. So that used to involve the process of bringing trays outside for a couple of hours one day, bringing them back inside to warm up overnight, back outside the next day to experience a little bit more wind and sunlight, back inside. I'd have to repeat that process over and over. It was a constant shuffle. It was annoying. It was a lot more extra work. It felt chaotic. But when we added this nursery greenhouse to the game, now my path for hardening off my seedlings was very straightforward and uniform. Today, I still start seeds indoors, but once they're germinated and the conditions are appropriate outside in the nursery greenhouse here, I can move the trays directly to the nursery greenhouse. Then once they're ready to move out into the field, I can harden them off very briefly out here on my little stage where I'm standing. Right now, they get a little bit roughened up by some extra sunlight and wind. And then a few days later, they're out in the field. That's a direct path. I'm not shuffling things back and forth all the time. I'm not stressing about whether something's dying in my yard while I'm out doing something else in the city. There's a lot more order. So the washing station and the nursery greenhouse are two great investments for us that have brought order to our garden. To find out the best place for you to start with changes to your infrastructure, think about the actions that you're taking throughout the growing season that are annoying. Where are the log jams happening? Where are you getting hung up? What tasks are you trying to avoid because they're just not pleasant or they're disorganized? Then take some time to solve that problem once so that you can keep benefiting from that investment year after year after year. Those are the most common problems that I see growers dealing with on the subject of order. I hope my suggestions will help you make some progress in each area so that you can restore order in your garden. Whenever you're struggling with your growing space, remember that fundamentally, gardening is an incredibly productive investment. Our annual costs of sun, seeds, soil, and water are very low. We just need to make some good decisions and exercise a little discipline. That way we keep everything productive, efficient, and orderly along the way. For more on this subject, check out my free workshop. It comes with 3 free workbooks, one of which is the Grower's Pathfinder, which will help you identify your current gardening style and hook you up with a list of personalized recommendations that will set you on track for success. That's all for today. I'll see you in the next one.